Before we begin, if you find value in what I create here, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if this genuinely resonates with you. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Volume low, distractions off. Let's go in. In the sterile white laboratories of post-war America, where men in starched coats pursued molecules with the fervour of alchemists seeking gold, a quiet revolution was brewing. The year was 1955, and the nation was wrestling with a peculiar paradox. It had won the greatest war in human history, achieved unprecedented prosperity, and yet its people could not sleep. They could not relax. They could not stop their hands from trembling or their minds from racing. The American century had arrived, and it was making everyone profoundly, desperately anxious. The war had ended a decade earlier, but its ghosts lingered. Men who had seen combat returned home changed, haunted by memories they could not speak about. They woke screaming in the night. They jumped at loud noises. They could not hold down jobs or maintain relationships. The term shell shock from the First World War had given way to combat fatigue, but the condition remained the same, a deep, persistent psychological wound that no doctor knew how to treat. And it was not just the veterans. Their wives, who had held families together through years of uncertainty, found that peace brought its own anxieties. The pressure to create perfect homes, to raise perfect children, to maintain perfect appearances was crushing. The suburbs were supposed to be paradise, but for many women they were prisons of isolation and unfulfilled expectations. The corporate world demanded conformity. The grey flannel suit became the uniform of American business, and beneath those suits beat hearts racing with anxiety. The ladder must be climbed, quotas must be met, the boss must be pleased. Competition was fierce, and failure was not an option. Men developed ulcers, they chain-smoked, they drank heavily, and they could not sleep. The pharmaceutical industry understood this. They had already given the world barbiturates, those heavy-handed chemical sledgehammers that could knock a person unconscious, but just as easily kill them. The line between a therapeutic dose and a lethal one was terrifyingly thin. An accidental overdose, a deliberate one, it made little difference. The barbiturates did not discriminate. Judy Garland, Marilyn Monroe, countless others, all found their final rest in the embrace of these unforgiving compounds. The medical establishment knew they needed something better, something safer. Something that could calm the modern nervous system without stopping the heart. At a pharmaceutical company in New Jersey called Hoffmann La Roche, a Polish chemist named Leo Sternbach was given an assignment that would change the world. He was told to find a new tranquilizer, something to compete with the blockbuster sedatives that other companies were developing. Sternbach, methodical and patient, began working with a class of compounds called benzodiazepines. For 2 years, he synthesized molecule after molecule, testing them on laboratory animals, looking for that elusive combination of efficacy and safety. He found nothing. The project was a failure. In 1957, frustrated and facing pressure to move on to more promising research, Sternbach and his colleague Earl Reeder began cleaning up the laboratory. There, on a shelf covered in dust, was a crystalline compound they had synthesized but never tested. It was labelled Row 5-0690. On a whim, perhaps out of scientific thoroughness or simple curiosity, they decided to give it one final trial. The results were extraordinary. In animal studies, the compound produced muscle relaxation and sedation without the respiratory depression that made barbiturates so dangerous. Mice given the drug became calm, their rigid muscles loosened, but they remained conscious and alert. The safety margin was enormous. You could give an animal many times the therapeutic dose and it would simply sleep it off. They had stumbled upon something unprecedented. The compound was not actually a benzodiazepine at all. During synthesis, the molecule had rearranged itself into an entirely different structure. A 7-membered ring fused with a 6-membered ring, with nitrogen atoms strategically placed. They had accidentally created the world's first benzodiazepine. Hoffmann-La-Roche, recognizing the potential, fast-tracked the compound through development. They called it chlordiazepoxide. The marketing department, understanding that no doctor would prescribe something with such an unwieldy name, gave it a brand name that would become synonymous with mid-century anxiety relief: Librium. When Librium hit the market in 1960, it was an immediate sensation. Here was a pill that could calm the nerves, relax tense muscles, and help people sleep, all without the danger of barbiturates. Doctors, who'd been terrified of prescribing sedatives after so many tragic overdoses, now had something they could hand out with confidence. The safety profile was revolutionary. A patient could take 10 times the recommended dose and wake up with nothing worse than a hangover. But Sternbach was not finished. Working in his laboratory, he began tinkering with the chlordiazepoxide molecule, making small modifications to see if he could improve upon perfection. In 1963, his team synthesized a new compound. It was more potent, faster acting, and even cleaner in its effects than Librium. The chemical name was diazepam. Hoffmann-La-Roche's marketing team outdid themselves this time. They named it Valium, derived from the Latin word valere, meaning to be strong or well. The choice was brilliant. It suggested strength, health, and validity. It was a name that promised not weakness or dependence, but restoration and balance. Valium was approved by the FDA in 1963, and what followed was perhaps the most successful pharmaceutical launch in history. Within 2 years, it had surpassed Librium to become the most prescribed drug in America. By 1969, it was the most prescribed drug in the entire world. At its peak in 1978, doctors were writing an astonishing 2.3 billion tablets worth of prescriptions for Valium every single year in the United States alone. The little yellow pills, the blue ones, the white ones, each strength color-coded for convenience, became the chemical wallpaper of American life. Valium was not a street drug. It was not some exotic substance from a distant land. It was medicine. It came from a doctor. It was prescribed. It was safe. It was normal. And for a brief, chemically mediated moment in the 1960s and 70s, an entire generation came to believe that anxiety, stress, and the general friction of daily existence were not things to be endured, but conditions to be treated, pharmaceutically, permanently. With a little pill you took 2 or 3 times a day, every day for the rest of your life. The transformation of the American household in the post-war era was profound and deeply contradictory. Women who had worked in factories during the war, who had built bombers and welded ships, were told to return to the kitchen. The suburban dream was being built acre by acre on the outskirts of every major city. Split-level homes with 2-car garages, manicured lawns, and the promise of domestic bliss. But something was wrong in paradise. The housewife, that idealized figure in her pressed dress and pearls, was suffocating. The endless repetition of domestic tasks, the isolation of the suburbs where houses were close but neighbours were strangers, the loss of identity that came with being defined solely through husband and children, it created a particular kind of anguish. Betty Friedan would call it the problem that has no name. The medical establishment had a name for it though, anxiety, and they had a solution. Women went to their family doctors complaining of nervousness, of tension headaches, of an inability to cope with the demands of running a household. They described feeling trapped, exhausted by the mundanity of it all, and their doctors, almost exclusively men, had been trained to see these complaints through a very specific lens. These were not social problems or existential questions. These were medical symptoms, and medical symptoms required medical treatment. The prescription pad came out. Librium first, then Valium. The little pills became as much a part of the suburban housewife's routine as morning coffee and afternoon soap operas. Take one in the morning to get through the breakfast rush and the school run. Take another at noon when the walls started closing in. Maybe a third before dinner to smooth the edges off the day and make the evening tolerable. The pharmaceutical companies marketed directly to this demographic, though not through television advertisements aimed at consumers. That would not be permitted until much later. Instead, they targeted doctors through medical journals and pharmaceutical representatives. The advertisements were revealing in their assumptions. They depicted harried housewives, women overwhelmed by children and household duties, women who were tense, irritable, difficult. The subtext was clear. These women were problems to be managed, and Valium was the management tool. One Hoffman La Roche advertisement from the era showed a woman surrounded by children, her face a mask of stress. The caption read, 35, single and psychoneurotic. Another showed a college student stressed about exams. The message was consistent. Any deviation from perfect placidity, any expression of normal human stress or dissatisfaction, was a medical condition requiring pharmaceutical intervention, and the women took the pills, not because they were weak or foolish, but because they were suffering, and this was the only help being offered. There was no discussion of whether the demands placed upon them were reasonable, no suggestion that the problem might be structural rather than personal, no acknowledgement that feeling stifled in a life circumscribed by other people's expectations might be a rational response rather than a symptom of illness. The pills worked, at least at first. Valium had a remarkable ability to smooth out anxiety, to take the sharp edges off reality and make the unbearable merely tedious. That persistent knot of tension in the chest loosened. The racing thoughts slowed. The world became softer, more manageable, more distant. But tolerance developed. The body adapted to the constant presence of the drug, and what had once required one pill now required two. Two became three. Three became a standing prescription that was refilled monthly without question, because doctors were told these drugs were safe, non-addictive. They were, after all, not barbiturates. The Rolling Stones captured this era perfectly in their 1966 song, a sardonic commentary on pharmaceutical motherhood. The lyrics spoke of a mother who needed something to help her through her busy day, to chase her clouds away. The song became an anthem, though whether women singing along were celebrating or mourning their chemical crutch was never quite clear. By the early 1970s, Valium consumption in the United States had reached epidemic proportions. One study estimated that between 15 and 20% of American women had used a benzodiazepine in the past year. These were not street addicts shooting up in back alleys. These were mothers, teachers, secretaries, nurses, respectable women with respectable prescriptions. The medical literature of the time shows a stunning lack of concern about this mass medication of the female population. Papers discussed the efficacy of benzodiazepines for various anxiety disorders, but there was little critical examination of why so many women seemed to require daily sedation to tolerate their lives. The feminist movement was beginning to ask these questions, pointing out that medicating women's dissatisfaction was a convenient way to avoid addressing its causes. But these voices were largely drowned out by the thundering success of Valium sales. The drug companies were making billions, doctors were keeping their patients happy and compliant, and the women themselves, many of them, were simply trying to survive. They did not know that the pills they took so trustingly were slowly, imperceptibly, changing their brain chemistry in ways that would make stopping nearly impossible. While housewives were being prescribed Valium for existential angst, the psychiatric establishment was undergoing its own revolution, and benzodiazepines were at the centre of it. The 1960s and 70s represented a watershed moment in the treatment of mental illness, and these new drugs played a pivotal role. Prior to the benzodiazepines, psychiatry's toolkit was limited and often brutal. Severe mental illness was treated with insulin shock therapy, which induced comas, with electroconvulsive therapy, which sent electrical currents through the brain to induce seizures, with prefrontal lobotomies, which involved severing connections in the brain's prefrontal cortex. These were not subtle interventions. They were desperate measures for desperate situations, and they often left patients worse off than before. For milder conditions, for the anxiety disorders and neuroses that filled psychiatric outpatient clinics, the options were talk therapy or barbiturates. Talk therapy was expensive, time-consuming, and of uncertain efficacy. Barbiturates were dangerous, potentially lethal, and turned patients into zombies. Benzodiazepines changed everything. Here was a drug that worked rapidly, was remarkably safe, and could be prescribed by any physician, not just psychiatrists. It democratized psychiatric care in a way that had never been possible before. A general practitioner could now treat anxiety disorders with the same confidence they treated high blood pressure. The drugs were genuinely effective. In controlled trials, benzodiazepines consistently outperformed placebos in reducing symptoms of anxiety. Patients reported feeling better, sleeping better, functioning better. For people suffering from panic attacks, where the heart races and breathing becomes impossible, and the overwhelming certainty of imminent death grips the chest, benzodiazepines could stop an attack in its tracks. For those with generalized anxiety disorder, where every moment is filled with vague but overwhelming dread, the drugs provided relief that no amount of talk therapy seemed to match. Emergency rooms began using benzodiazepines for alcohol withdrawal, a condition that can be fatal if untreated. The drugs prevented seizures, reduced tremors, and made the agonizing process of detoxification bearable. Anesthesiologists used them before surgery to calm patients and induce amnesia, so that the terrifying experience of being wheeled into an operating room would not be remembered. Neurologists found that certain benzodiazepines, particularly clonazepam and diazepam, were effective anticonvulsants, capable of stopping seizures when other medications failed. They became essential emergency medications, the first line of defense against status epilepticus, a condition where seizures do not stop and can cause permanent brain damage or death. New benzodiazepines were being synthesized and brought to market regularly. Each promised some advantage over the last. Oxazepam was marketed as gentler, with a shorter half-life that meant less hangover effect. Lorazepam was promoted for its reliable absorption and its usefulness in treating acute agitation. Alprazolam, which would later be marketed as Xanax, was developed specifically for panic disorder and became the gold standard treatment for that condition. By the mid-1970s, benzodiazepines were being prescribed for everything: anxiety, insomnia, muscle spasms, seizures, alcohol withdrawal, pre-surgical sedation, irritable bowel syndrome, tension headaches, the stress of caring for a sick relative, the pressure of final exams. The indications kept expanding. If a patient complained of any form of psychological or even physical distress, a benzodiazepine prescription was often the first response. The medical literature was overwhelmingly positive. Thousands of papers documented the drug's effectiveness. The side effects seemed minimal. Some drowsiness, perhaps some difficulty with coordination. These were deemed acceptable trade-offs for the relief the drugs provided. The package inserts mention the theoretical possibility of dependence, but this was presented as rare, something that only happened with high doses or in patients with a history of substance abuse. Doctors were told and genuinely believed that they were witnessing a therapeutic revolution. Mental suffering, which had plagued humanity since the beginning of time, could now be treated effectively and safely with a simple pill. It seemed almost miraculous. But beneath this triumph, cracks were beginning to show. Some patients who tried to stop taking benzodiazepines after months or years of use found they could not. They experienced symptoms that were dismissed as the return of their original anxiety. No one yet understood that the symptoms were not a return but a creation, withdrawal from the drug itself. The brain, adapted to the constant presence of the medication, was now dependent on it to function normally. A few researchers were beginning to notice something troubling. Long-term benzodiazepine users seemed to develop tolerance to the therapeutic effects, requiring higher and higher doses to achieve the same relief. Some patients on stable doses for years suddenly found the medication stopped working, and there were reports, still scattered and anecdotal, of severe, prolonged withdrawal syndromes in patients who discontinued the drugs too quickly. But these warning signs were drowned out by the chorus of success. Benzodiazepines had become too integral to modern medicine, too profitable for pharmaceutical companies, and too convenient for doctors to question seriously. They were everywhere, in every medicine cabinet, prescribed millions of times a day across the world. The therapeutic revolution marched on, unaware that it was building a foundation on sand. While Valium ruled the respectable world of prescription pads and pharmacy counters, a parallel story was unfolding in the shadows. Benzodiazepines, for all their medical legitimacy, were also becoming valuable commodities on the black market. They were pills that altered consciousness, and wherever such substances exist, there will be people who want them for reasons their doctors would not approve. The diversion began small and obvious. People with legitimate prescriptions realized they could sell their pills. A monthly script for 60 Valium tablets could be worth significant money to the right buyer. Pharmacies, particularly in poor neighborhoods, began to be targeted for break-ins. Thieves knew exactly what they were looking for: the benzodiazepine shelf. But the real criminal innovation came from a different direction entirely. In the late 1970s and through the 1980s, organized crime discovered benzodiazepines, particularly Rohypnol, a drug that had never been approved in the United States but was widely available in Europe and Latin America. Rohypnol, known by its generic name flunitrazepam, was a potent benzodiazepine, roughly 10 times stronger than Valium. In therapeutic doses, it was used for severe insomnia and as a pre-anesthetic. But it had properties that made it particularly attractive to criminals. It was fast-acting, producing sedation within 15 to 20 minutes. It caused significant amnesia, meaning the user often could not remember events that occurred while under its influence. And crucially, it was tasteless and odorless, dissolving completely in liquid without detection. The drug began appearing in nightclubs and bars, not prescribed but purchased on the street or brought across borders. It was being used as a weapon. Slipped into drinks, it would render the victim compliant, unable to resist and later unable to remember. The term date rape drug entered the cultural lexicon, and Rohypnol became its poster child. The phenomenon was not limited to Rohypnol. Other benzodiazepines, particularly alprazolam and lorazepam, were also being used for the same horrific purpose. Law enforcement struggled to respond. These were not illegal drugs like heroin or cocaine. They were medications approved by regulatory agencies prescribed by doctors. The legal framework for dealing with their abuse was murky. In 1996, the United States Congress passed the Drug-Induced Rape Prevention and Punishment Act, which increased penalties for using any controlled substance to facilitate sexual assault. Rohypnol was specifically targeted, though it was already illegal in the US. Hoffmann La Roche, the manufacturer, reformulated the drug to include a blue dye that would be visible in drinks, though this was only a partial solution. But benzodiazepines were also finding a different criminal application, one more mundane but far more widespread. They were becoming the perfect complement to other drugs of abuse. Heroin addicts discovered that adding a benzodiazepine to their ritual intensified the high, deepened the nod. The combination was synergistic and exceptionally dangerous, as both drugs suppressed respiration. The number of overdose deaths involving the combination of opioids and benzodiazepines began to climb. Cocaine users found that benzodiazepines could smooth out the crash, taking the edge off the paranoia and agitation that followed a binge. Methamphetamine users took them to force sleep after days of chemically induced wakefulness. For polydrug users, benzodiazepines became essential tools in managing the chaos of their consumption. The prison system became saturated with benzodiazepines. Inmates facing the psychological stress of incarceration craved any form of chemical escape. The drugs were smuggled in through various means: visitors, corrupt guards, packages, even drones dropping them into prison yards. Inside, they became a currency, traded for protection, favours, or other contraband. Prescription fraud became an art form. Sophisticated criminals stole prescription pads, forged signatures, or created entirely fictitious medical practices. Pharmacies were presented with prescriptions that looked perfect on paper, but were completely fraudulent. Doctor shopping became common, where individuals would visit multiple physicians with similar complaints, accumulating prescriptions from each without any doctor knowing about the others. Some physicians, motivated by greed or coercion, became pill mills, writing thousands of benzodiazepine prescriptions for cash without legitimate medical justification. These operations often operated in plain sight, with lines of patients wrapping around buildings, each waiting for their turn to exchange money for a prescription. Law enforcement attempted various strategies to combat diversion. Prescription drug monitoring programs were established, databases that tracked controlled substance prescriptions across a state. These helped identify doctor shopping and flag suspicious prescribing patterns. But they were incomplete solutions, as they did not cover all states and could not account for drugs obtained through theft or smuggling. The pharmaceutical companies, meanwhile, maintained a careful distance from these issues. They were selling legitimate medicine through legitimate channels. What happened to their products after that was not their responsibility, they argued. They funded education programs about prescription drug abuse, but these were modest efforts compared to their massive marketing campaigns promoting the drugs in the first place. By the early 2000s, benzodiazepines had become a significant component of the prescription drug abuse epidemic sweeping the United States. They were involved in thousands of emergency room visits annually. They contributed to a rising tide of overdose deaths, particularly when combined with opioids. And yet they remained widely prescribed, widely available, and widely used. The pills that had promised safety and legitimacy had found their way into the darkest corners of society, used as weapons, as commodities, as tools of self-destruction. The first cracks in the benzodiazepine consensus appeared in the late 1970s, not from medical researchers, but from patients themselves. Women, primarily, began to speak out about their experiences trying to stop taking the medications they had been prescribed for years. They described something that did not fit the official medical narrative. When they tried to discontinue Valium or Librium, even tapering slowly as their doctors advised, they experienced symptoms that were far worse than the anxiety that had led to the prescription in the first place. Severe insomnia that lasted for weeks, panic attacks of an intensity they had never experienced, muscle twitches and tremors, hypersensitivity to light and sound, a feeling of unreality, as if the world had become strange and threatening. Their doctors, by and large, did not believe them. The symptoms were dismissed as the return of the original anxiety disorder, proof that the patient still needed the medication. Some women were told the problem was psychological, that they were simply afraid to give up the security blanket of the pills. A few were referred to psychiatrists for issues with dependency. But the women persisted. They began to find each other, forming support groups where they could share their experiences without judgment. They read medical literature and discovered that their symptoms matched the clinical description of benzodiazepine withdrawal, a syndrome that was acknowledged in the scientific literature but consistently downplayed in communications with patients and doctors. The medical establishment was slow to respond, in part because acknowledging the problem would mean admitting a massive error. For 2 decades, doctors had been prescribing these drugs freely, reassuring patients of their safety, encouraging long-term use for chronic anxiety. To admit that millions of patients might now be physically dependent on their medication, that stopping would require a difficult and prolonged process of withdrawal, was not something the profession was eager to do. But the evidence became impossible to ignore. In 1980, a landmark paper was published in the British Medical Journal by Dr. Malcolm Lader, a psychopharmacologist at the Institute of Psychiatry in London. The paper was titled "Benzodiazepines, the Opium of the Masses," and it pulled no punches. Lader argued that benzodiazepines, particularly when used long-term, were causing widespread dependence. He criticised the pharmaceutical industry's marketing practices and challenged the medical community's complacency. The paper caused a sensation. It was followed by more research, more papers, more voices joining the chorus of concern. Studies began to show that benzodiazepine dependence could develop even at therapeutic doses, even in patients with no history of substance abuse. The withdrawal syndrome was real, severe, and could last for months, sometimes longer. In the United Kingdom, the response was swift and dramatic. The Committee on Safety of Medicines issued new guidelines in 1988, recommending that benzodiazepines be prescribed only for short-term relief of severe anxiety or insomnia, and that treatment should be limited to 2 to 4 weeks. Doctors were warned about the risks of dependence and advised to taper patients slowly off the drugs. The pharmaceutical companies fought back. Hoffmann La Roche in particular faced a public relations nightmare. Valium, their blockbuster drug, was now being portrayed as dangerous and addictive. They commissioned their own research, funded their own experts, and argued that the benefits of benzodiazepines still outweighed the risks when used appropriately. Legal challenges began to mount. In the UK, thousands of patients who believed they'd been made dependent on benzodiazepines filed lawsuits against the pharmaceutical companies and the doctors who had prescribed them. The cases were eventually consolidated into a massive class action lawsuit. In 1994, after years of legal wrangling, the case was settled. The patients received nothing. The judge ruled that while benzodiazepines could indeed cause dependence, this was a known risk, and patients had been adequately warned through the package inserts that accompanied the drugs. It was a hollow victory for the pharmaceutical industry. The damage to benzodiazepines' reputation was done. Prescribing rates, particularly for long-term use, began to decline. New guidelines emphasized that benzodiazepines should be used only for acute situations, not as chronic therapy. But changing medical practice proved difficult. Doctors who had been prescribing benzodiazepines for decades had thousands of patients who were already taking them long-term. Tapering someone off benzodiazepines is a slow, difficult process. It requires patient cooperation, medical supervision, and considerable time. Many patients were terrified to stop. having heard about or experienced the severity of withdrawal, some doctors simply continued prescribing rather than face the challenge of helping their patients discontinue. Support organizations began to form, dedicated to helping people withdraw from benzodiazepines. The Ashton Manual, a comprehensive guide to benzodiazepine withdrawal, written by Professor Heather Ashton, became the gold standard resource. It outlined slow tapering schedules, explained the neuroscience of withdrawal, and provided practical advice for managing symptoms. The internet became a crucial resource. Online forums and support groups allowed people going through withdrawal to connect, share strategies, and offer encouragement. These communities documented the reality of benzodiazepine withdrawal in granular detail. The waves and windows of symptoms, the protracted withdrawal that could last years, the neurological damage that seemed to persist even after the drug was out of the system. Medical researchers began to take notice. Brain imaging studies showed that long-term benzodiazepine use was associated with changes in brain structure, particularly in areas involved in memory and emotional processing. Cognitive testing revealed deficits in attention, memory, and executive function in long-term users. Some of these deficits persisted even after the drugs were discontinued, raising the disturbing possibility of permanent damage. By the early 2000s, the medical consensus had shifted. Benzodiazepines were no longer seen as the miracle cure they had once appeared to be. They were recognized as powerful drugs that could cause physical dependence, cognitive impairment, and a difficult withdrawal syndrome. The official recommendations now stated clearly, benzodiazepines should be used only for short-term relief of severe symptoms at the lowest effective dose for the shortest possible time. But this left a problem. What about the millions of people who were already taking these drugs long-term? What about the patients who had been on Valium or Klonopin for 10, 20, 30 years? For them, the damage was already done. They faced a choice between continuing a medication that was now recognized as harmful or undergoing a withdrawal process that could be agonizing and prolonged. Many chose to stay on the drugs, better the devil you know. Just as the medical community was coming to terms with the problems of benzodiazepines, the pharmaceutical industry launched a new campaign that would create an entirely new generation of users. The drug was alprazolam, marketed under the brand name Xanax, and it would become the defining anxiety medication of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Xanax was not new. It had been approved by the FDA in 1981, specifically for the treatment of panic disorder. But in the late 1990s and 2000s, its use exploded. Unlike Valium, which was associated with depressed housewives of the 1970s, Xanax was marketed as a modern solution for modern anxiety. It was fast-acting, powerful, and effective. It came in convenient dosages, including the infamous 2 mg bars that became known as Xanax bars, or simply bars. The timing was perfect. America in the late 1990s and 2000s was experiencing a new wave of anxiety. The peace dividend of the post-Cold War era had given way to the terrorism fears of 9/11, the economic stress of the 2008 financial crisis, and the perpetual psychological pressure of the information age. Social media was creating new forms of anxiety and depression, particularly among young people. Xanax was positioned as the solution. Unlike the older benzodiazepines, it was seen as sophisticated, selective, precision-targeted to panic disorder. Doctors, particularly psychiatrists, prescribed it liberally. The drug's short half-life meant it worked quickly, providing near-instant relief from panic symptoms. For someone experiencing a panic attack, where the heart races and breathing becomes impossible, and death feels imminent, Xanax was a miracle. Within 20 minutes, the terror would subside, the physical symptoms would ease, and the world would become manageable again. But that short half-life was a double-edged sword. The drug left the system quickly, which meant the relief was fleeting. Patients found themselves taking it multiple times a day, chasing the periods between doses when anxiety would creep back in. The rapid onset and offset created a cycle that was particularly conducive to psychological dependence. The brain learned to associate the drug with relief, and the urge to take it became overwhelming whenever anxiety surfaced. The drug culture of the 2000s and 2010s embraced Xanax in a way that Valium had never been embraced. It became referenced in hip-hop lyrics, mentioned casually in social media posts, normalized as a coping mechanism for the stresses of modern life. Taking Xanax was not something to hide. It was something to acknowledge, almost to celebrate. The stigma that had surrounded psychiatric medication was fading, replaced by an acceptance that mental health treatment was normal, necessary, even fashionable. Memes proliferated. Xanax and chill. Images of Xanax bars with captions about dealing with anxiety. The drug became part of the cultural vocabulary of a generation that was more anxious, more medicated, and more open about both than any before it. College students used Xanax to cope with academic pressure and social anxiety. Young professionals took it to get through presentations and high-stress meetings. People navigating breakups, job losses, family crises reached for the pills as a first line of defense against emotional pain. The medical guidelines about short-term use were widely ignored. Psychiatrists prescribed Xanax for months, years, indefinitely. The warnings about dependence were acknowledged in principle but dismissed in practice. Patients were told they had a chronic condition, panic disorder or generalized anxiety disorder, that required chronic treatment. What happened next was predictable to anyone who understood the history of benzodiazepines, but seemed to catch the medical community off guard nonetheless. A new wave of dependence and withdrawal emerged, this time among younger patients who had started taking Xanax in their 20s or 30s. These patients, when they tried to stop, discovered the same brutal reality that the Valium users of the 1970s had discovered. Withdrawal from Xanax, because of its short half-life and high potency, was often worse than withdrawal from older benzodiazepines. The symptoms came on quickly and intensely. Severe rebound anxiety, insomnia that lasted for weeks, seizures in those who stopped abruptly, a host of neurological symptoms that seemed to persist indefinitely. Online communities of people trying to withdraw from Xanax grew into massive support networks. They documented their experiences in excruciating detail, creating repositories of knowledge about how to taper, how to manage symptoms, how to survive the months or years of post-acute withdrawal syndrome. The medical literature began to catch up. Papers were published documenting the challenges of Xanax withdrawal, the need for extremely slow tapers, the high rate of relapse among those who tried to discontinue. Cognitive behavioral therapy and other non-pharmaceutical interventions were promoted as alternatives, but for many patients, the psychological dependence on the quick fix that Xanax provided was too strong to overcome. The pharmaceutical industry, meanwhile, had moved on to other markets. Xanax's patent had expired in the early 1990s, and generic alprazolam flooded the market, driving down prices and profits. New psychiatric medications, particularly SSRIs and SNRIs, were being marketed as first-line treatments for anxiety disorders, though they took weeks to work and had their own side effect profiles. But Xanax's cultural moment was far from over. In the 2010s, it became intertwined with another epidemic, the opioid crisis. The combination of benzodiazepines and opioids was particularly deadly. Both drugs suppressed respiration, and together they created a synergistic effect that could stop breathing altogether. The CDC began issuing warnings about co-prescribing, but many patients were getting their medications from different doctors who did not coordinate care. overdose deaths involving benzodiazepines, almost always in combination with opioids, skyrocketed. In 2019, benzodiazepines were involved in over 9,000 overdose deaths in the United States. The pills that had promised safety and relief had become a significant contributor to one of the deadliest drug epidemics in American history. Young people, in particular, were dying. The combination of Xanax and opioid pain pills, both obtained through prescriptions or diverted from legitimate medical use, was killing teenagers and young adults at alarming rates. Rappers who had glorified the substances in their music died from the very combinations they had rapped about. Public health officials struggled to respond. Unlike opioids, where medication-assisted treatment with methadone or buprenorphine was available, there was no equivalent for benzodiazepines. The only way to safely discontinue was a slow taper, which required medical supervision and patient commitment. The Xanax generation found itself trapped in the same cycle that had trapped their grandmother's generation decades before. They had been prescribed a drug that worked brilliantly in the short term, but created problems that were far worse than the original symptoms in the long term, and the medical system that had created the problem seemed ill-equipped to solve it. To understand how benzodiazepines transformed from miracle cure to medical disaster, we must journey into the microscopic architecture of the brain, into the world of neurotransmitters and receptors, where chemical messages determine every thought, every feeling, every breath. The human brain is an electrochemical machine of staggering complexity. Its 100 billion neurons communicate through chemical messengers called neurotransmitters. These molecules cross the tiny gaps between neurons, the synapses, and bind to receptors on the receiving neuron, either exciting it to fire or inhibiting it from doing so. The balance between excitation and inhibition is what allows the brain to function. The primary inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain is gamma-aminobutyric acid, mercifully abbreviated to GABA. When GABA binds to its receptors, it makes neurons less likely to fire. It calms neural activity. In a sense, GABA is the brain's natural tranquilizer, the chemical brake that prevents runaway excitation and keeps the system stable. There are several types of GABA receptors, but the most important for our story is the GABA-A receptor. This is a complex protein structure embedded in the neuron's membrane, forming a channel that, when activated, allows chloride ions to flow into the cell. This influx of negatively charged ions makes the neuron's interior more negative, making it harder for the cell to fire. The result is inhibition, calming, sedation. The GABA-A receptor is not just a simple on-off switch. It is a sophisticated piece of molecular machinery with multiple binding sites, places where different molecules can attach and modulate its function. There is the GABA binding site, where the neurotransmitter itself attaches. There is the benzodiazepine binding site, and there are sites for barbiturates, alcohol, and other sedative substances. When a benzodiazepine molecule binds to its designated site on the GABA-A receptor, it does not activate the receptor directly. Instead, it makes the receptor more sensitive to GABA. It is a positive allosteric modulator, a molecule that enhances the effect of the natural neurotransmitter. When GABA binds to a receptor that also has a benzodiazepine attached, the channel opens more frequently and stays open longer. More chloride flows in. The neuron becomes more inhibited. This is why benzodiazepines work so well. They amplify the brain's natural calming system. They do not force sedation through some foreign mechanism. They simply turn up the volume on the brain's existing tranquilizer. But the brain is not passive. It is constantly adapting, constantly seeking equilibrium. When benzodiazepines enhance GABA signaling day after day, week after week, the brain notices that it is being over-inhibited, and so it compensates, The adaptation happens at multiple levels. The number of GABA-A receptors on neuronal membranes decreases, a process called downregulation. The receptors that remain become less sensitive to both GABA and benzodiazepines, requiring higher levels of the drug to achieve the same effect. This is tolerance. Meanwhile, the brain's excitatory systems, particularly those involving the neurotransmitter glutamate, become more active to compensate for the increased inhibition. The system is trying to maintain balance, to function normally despite the constant presence of the drug. This new equilibrium is fragile. The brain has adapted to function with the drug. Remove the drug suddenly, and the system is thrown into chaos. There are too few GABA receptors, and they are too insensitive to do their job. The excitatory systems, which have been ramped up to overcome the drug-induced inhibition, are now running unopposed. The result is a state of hyperexcitability. Neurons fire too easily, too often. The brain is flooded with excitatory signals that cannot be properly controlled. This is withdrawal. The symptoms reflect this underlying neurological storm. Anxiety, far worse than the original anxiety that led to the prescription, because the brain's natural anxiety suppression system is compromised. Insomnia, because the circuits that regulate sleep are disrupted. Seizures, in the most severe cases, because the threshold for neuronal firing has been lowered to the point where cascading electrical activity can propagate unchecked. There are other symptoms too, strange and terrifying ones that seem to have no clear explanation. Muscle twitches and tremors, sensitivity to light and sound, depersonalization and derealization, the feeling that the self is not real, that the world is not real. These may reflect changes in areas of the brain beyond the primary GABA systems, secondary adaptations that developed during long-term drug exposure. The recovery process is slow because the brain's adaptations must be reversed. GABA receptors must be upregulated, return to normal numbers and sensitivity. Excitatory systems must be downregulated. This neuroplastic remodeling takes time, months at minimum, sometimes years. Some individuals seem to experience prolonged, even permanent changes. Long-term benzodiazepine users who successfully withdraw sometimes report cognitive difficulties that persist indefinitely. Problems with memory, attention, processing speed. Brain imaging studies have shown structural changes in long-term users, reduced volume in certain brain regions, altered connectivity between areas. Whether these changes are truly permanent or whether the brain can fully recover given enough time remains a subject of research and debate. What is clear is that benzodiazepines, for all their apparent safety in the short term, are not benign in their long-term effects on brain structure and function. The bitter irony is that the very mechanism that makes benzodiazepines effective, their ability to enhance the brain's natural calming system, is also what makes them dangerous. By amplifying GABA signaling, they trigger adaptations that leave the brain dependent on their continued presence. The miracle cure becomes a prison. The medication becomes the disease. The story of benzodiazepines is not solely an American tale, though the United States has been central to both their development and their excess. The drugs spread across the globe, and each country has grappled with them in its own way, shaped by different medical cultures, regulatory frameworks, and social attitudes toward mental health and pharmaceuticals. In Europe, where the drugs were first recognized as problematic, the response has been varied but generally more cautious than in the United States. The United Kingdom, scarred by the experience of widespread benzodiazepine dependence in the 1980s and 90s, implemented strict prescribing guidelines. Doctors are trained to view benzodiazepines as short-term emergency treatments only. Prescription rates are monitored, and physicians who overprescribe can face regulatory sanctions. France, interestingly, became one of the highest per capita consumers of benzodiazepines in the world. The French medical system, with its emphasis on pharmaceuticals as first-line treatment and its generous reimbursement policies, created an environment where benzodiazepine prescriptions were routine. By the 2010s, an estimated 1 in 5 French adults had taken a benzodiazepine in the past year. Public health campaigns attempted to reduce consumption, with mixed success. The cultural acceptance of medication for psychological distress was deeply entrenched. In Japan, benzodiazepines found a particularly receptive market. The stigma around mental illness in Japanese society meant that people were often unwilling to seek psychiatric care or admit to psychological problems. But visiting a general practitioner with complaints of insomnia or nervousness was acceptable. Doctors, faced with patients who would not consider therapy or psychiatric referral, prescribed benzodiazepines in vast quantities. Japan developed some of the highest rates of benzodiazepine prescribing in the developed world. In developing countries, the pattern was different but no less concerning. Benzodiazepines were often available over the counter, without prescription, in pharmacies across Latin America, Africa, and parts of Asia. The regulatory infrastructure to control pharmaceutical distribution was weak or absent. This made the drugs accessible to people who might benefit from them but could not afford medical care. But it also meant there was no medical supervision, no guidance on appropriate use, and no system to prevent dependence. In some countries, benzodiazepines became drugs of abuse in their own right. In South Africa, particularly in poor communities, a culture of benzodiazepine abuse developed. The drugs, often diverted from legitimate medical supplies or manufactured illegally, were consumed in high doses for their intoxicating effects. They were mixed with other substances, including alcohol and cannabis, creating dangerous combinations. The pharmaceutical companies that manufactured benzodiazepines operated globally, and their marketing strategies adapted to different markets. In countries with strict regulations, they emphasized medical necessity and proper use. In less regulated markets, they promoted their products more aggressively, sometimes with claims that would not have been permitted in their home countries. International organizations began to take notice. The World Health Organization added several benzodiazepines to its list of essential medicines, recognizing their legitimate medical uses, but also issued guidelines about the risks of long-term use and the importance of careful prescribing. The International Narcotics Control Board, which monitors controlled substances globally, included benzodiazepines in its reporting and urged countries to implement measures to prevent abuse and diversion. The Internet created new challenges. Online pharmacies, many operating from countries with lax regulations, began selling benzodiazepines without prescription to customers worldwide. A person in any country could, with a credit card and an email address, order quantities of Valium or Xanax that would be delivered to their door. Some of these operations were legitimate businesses serving customers who had difficulty accessing medication. Others were criminal enterprises selling counterfeit or contaminated products. The problem of counterfeit benzodiazepines became particularly acute in the 2010s. Illegal manufacturers, particularly in China and India, began producing fake Xanax bars and other benzodiazepine pills. These counterfeits often contained the wrong dose of the active ingredient, no active ingredient at all, or, most dangerously, were pressed with fentanyl or other potent synthetic opioids. Users who thought they were taking a benzodiazepine were actually consuming a potentially lethal opioid. The global regulatory response has been fragmented. Some countries implemented prescription monitoring systems, electronic databases that track controlled substance prescriptions and flag unusual patterns. Others restricted the number of pills that could be prescribed at one time or required special authorization for long-term use. A few countries moved benzodiazepines to more restrictive scheduling categories, treating them similarly to opioids. but enforcement remained challenging. The drugs were too widely used in legitimate medical practice to ban, too profitable to ignore, and too embedded in medical culture to easily replace. And in many parts of the world, the medical infrastructure to provide alternative treatments, psychological therapies, or other interventions simply did not exist. The result is a patchwork global landscape. In some countries, benzodiazepines are carefully controlled and used sparingly. In others, they are prescribed liberally and consumed widely. In still others, they are diverted, abused, and trafficked as part of the illegal drug trade. The little pills that were supposed to bring calm and safety to the world have instead created a complex web of medical, social, and regulatory challenges that span the globe. As the problems with benzodiazepines became clear, the search for alternatives intensified. The pharmaceutical industry, academia, and government agencies all invested in finding the Holy Grail. A medication that could treat anxiety and insomnia effectively without the risk of dependence or the cognitive impairment that plagued benzodiazepines. One early attempt was buspirone, marketed as Busper, which was approved in the mid-1980s. It worked through a completely different mechanism, targeting serotonin receptors rather than GABA. In theory, this meant it should not cause the tolerance, dependence, and withdrawal issues associated with benzodiazepines. In clinical trials, it showed efficacy for generalized anxiety disorder. But buspirone had a fatal flaw from a practical standpoint. It did not work immediately. While benzodiazepines provided relief within minutes to hours, buspirone took weeks to build up therapeutic effects similar to antidepressants. For patients suffering from acute anxiety, this delay was unacceptable. Moreover, people who had previously taken benzodiazepines often reported that buspirone simply did not feel effective. It lacked the immediate, tangible sense of relief that benzodiazepines provided. Doctors and patients alike were skeptical, and buspirone never achieved widespread use. The development of selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, the SSRIs, initially seemed promising for anxiety treatment. Drugs like Prozac, Zoloft, and Paxil were approved not just for depression, but for various anxiety disorders, panic disorder, social anxiety disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, obsessive-compulsive disorder. They had a different side effect profile than benzodiazepines and were not associated with physical dependence in the same way. But SSRIs came with their own problems. They took weeks to work. They caused sexual dysfunction in a majority of users. They could trigger activation and increased anxiety when first started, requiring patients to push through an initial worsening before experiencing improvement. And while they were not thought to cause physical dependence, many people who tried to stop taking them experienced withdrawal symptoms, rebranded as discontinuation syndrome, to distance the drugs from the stigma of addiction. For acute anxiety, for panic attacks, for the person who needed relief now, SSRIs were not the answer. Benzodiazepines remained the gold standard for immediate symptom control. Newer drugs were developed. Pregabalin and gabapentin, anticonvulsants that also had anxiety-reducing properties, were promoted as alternatives. But they too came with side effects, including sedation, weight gain, and, it turned out, their own potential for abuse and dependence, particularly in people with histories of substance abuse. Hydroxyzine, an antihistamine with sedative properties, was used off-label for anxiety. Beta blockers like propranolol were prescribed for performance anxiety and the physical symptoms of anxiety like rapid heartbeat. Antipsychotic medications, particularly the newer atypicals, were sometimes prescribed for anxiety, though their side effect profiles were concerning and their use in this context was controversial. Non-pharmaceutical interventions were promoted with increasing urgency. Cognitive behavioral therapy, particularly specialized protocols for panic disorder, and generalized anxiety disorder showed efficacy in clinical trials comparable to or better than medication. Mindfulness-based therapies, acceptance and commitment therapy, and other psychotherapeutic approaches were developed and refined. But therapy faced practical obstacles. It required trained therapists, which were in short supply in many areas. It required time, both the therapists and the patients. It required active engagement and work from the patient, which not everyone was willing or able to provide. And it did not work immediately. Even the most effective therapy protocols required weeks or months to show results. For a person in the grip of a panic attack, being told to do breathing exercises or challenge their catastrophic thoughts was often insufficient. The immediacy and reliability of benzodiazepine relief was hard to replicate through any other means. Lifestyle interventions, exercise, meditation, yoga, dietary changes were all recommended and all showed some evidence of benefit. But again, they were not quick fixes. They required sustained effort and provided modest, gradual improvements rather than dramatic relief. The search for pharmacological alternatives continued. Researchers explored drugs targeting different neurotransmitter systems, orexin antagonists for insomnia, compounds targeting specific serotonin receptor subtypes, even psychedelic substances like psilocybin for treatment-resistant anxiety and depression. Some of these showed promise in early studies, but none had yet emerged as a clear replacement for benzodiazepines in all their applications. The truth was that benzodiazepines were remarkably good at what they did. They worked quickly, reliably, and for a wide range of symptoms. Their mechanism of action, enhancing the brain's natural inhibitory system, was elegantly suited to the task of reducing anxiety and promoting sleep. The problem was not that they didn't work. The problem was that they worked too well, creating a chemical solution to problems that were often psychological, social, or existential in nature. The medical community found itself in a bind. It had a class of drugs that were effective but dangerous with long-term use. It had alternatives that were safer in some respects but less effective, slower acting, or came with their own set of problems. And it had millions of patients who were suffering and needed help. The result was a compromise that satisfied no one. Official guidelines recommended benzodiazepines for short-term use only, but in practice, they continued to be prescribed long-term for chronic conditions. Alternatives were recommended as first-line treatments, but when they failed or were not tolerated, benzodiazepines were still there, still available, still the reliable option. The holy grail of a perfect anti-anxiety medication, one that worked immediately, had no side effects, caused no dependence, and could be used indefinitely, remained elusive. Perhaps it would always remain so. Perhaps the very nature of these drugs, their ability to alter consciousness and provide chemical relief from psychological suffering, meant that any effective medication would carry risks. We arrive now at the present day, at a moment of reckoning. The story of benzodiazepines, which began with such hope in the sterile laboratories of the 1950s, has led us through triumph, excess, dependence, and tragedy. The question that faces us now is what to do with the legacy. There are millions of people currently taking benzodiazepines. Some have been on them for decades, prescribed in an era when the risks were not fully understood or acknowledged. Others are newer users, prescribe the drugs despite the current guidelines cautioning against long-term use. All of them face difficult choices. For those who want to stop, the path is treacherous. Benzodiazepine withdrawal, particularly from high-potency drugs like Xanax or Klonopin taken for extended periods, must be done slowly and carefully. The Ashton method, developed by Professor Heather Ashton, remains the gold standard. A gradual taper over months or even years, often switching first to a longer-acting benzodiazepine like Valium to make the process smoother. But even with careful tapering, withdrawal can be brutal. the symptoms can be so severe that many people cannot complete the process. They reach a point where the suffering becomes unbearable, and they resume taking the medication, sometimes at a higher dose than before. The medical system often provides inadequate support for people trying to withdraw, with many doctors unfamiliar with proper tapering protocols or dismissive of withdrawal symptoms. Specialized clinics and support programs have emerged, but they are few and far between. Online communities continue to be the primary source of information and support for many people. Forums where those going through withdrawal can share experiences, offer encouragement, and provide practical advice. These communities have documented the reality of benzodiazepine dependence and withdrawal in ways that academic medicine has been slow to acknowledge. For those who choose to stay on their medication, the decision is fraught with uncertainty. Is it better to remain on a drug that provides relief but carries risks of cognitive decline and other long-term health effects, or to endure the agony of withdrawal in hopes of eventual recovery? There is no clear answer, and the decision is deeply personal. The medical establishment continues to grapple with its role in creating this crisis. Professional organizations have issued revised guidelines. Medical schools have updated their curricula to emphasize the risks of benzodiazepines, and continuing education programs for physicians stress the importance of careful prescribing. But the culture of medicine changes slowly, and many doctors continue to prescribe as they always have. The pharmaceutical industry has largely moved on. Most benzodiazepines are now generic, with profit margins far lower than when they were under patent. The companies that brought these drugs to market have redirected their research and marketing budgets toward newer medications. They maintain that they marketed their products appropriately, that they disclosed risks, and that prescribing decisions were made by independent physicians based on medical judgment. Legal accountability has been limited. Unlike the opioid crisis, where pharmaceutical companies have faced massive lawsuits and settlements for their role in overprescribing and downplaying addiction risks, the benzodiazepine industry has largely escaped such consequences. The drugs are older, the marketing practices are more difficult to scrutinize, and the scientific understanding of their risks evolves slowly over decades rather than being deliberately hidden. Public health officials have begun to pay more attention. The CDC and other agencies have issued warnings about the dangers of combining benzodiazepines with opioids, a combination that significantly increases overdose risk. Prescription drug monitoring programs are being improved to flag potentially problematic prescribing patterns. Some states have implemented policies limiting the duration of initial benzodiazepine prescriptions, or requiring special authorization for long-term use. But these are modest steps, incremental improvements to a system that created the problem in the first place. The fundamental question remains unanswered. How should society treat anxiety, insomnia, and psychological suffering? Is pharmaceutical intervention appropriate, and if so, under what circumstances? What is the proper balance between individual autonomy, medical paternalism, and public health? The benzodiazepine story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about modern medicine and modern life. It reveals how easily a drug can go from miracle to menace, how market forces can shape medical practice in ways that harm patients, how the promise of a chemical solution can seduce both doctors and patients into ignoring warning signs. It also reveals something deeper about our relationship with discomfort. The post-war era that gave us benzodiazepines was an era that increasingly viewed any form of psychological or physical discomfort as a problem to be solved rather than an experience to be endured. This was not entirely wrong. Suffering is real, and the relief that medicine can provide is valuable. But there is a difference between acute suffering that requires intervention and the ordinary anxieties of existence that are part of being human. The danger of benzodiazepines was not just their chemical effects on the brain, but the message they carried. that you should never have to feel anxious, that discomfort is abnormal, that there is a pill for every problem. This message has been internalized by multiple generations now. The expectation of pharmaceutical relief, the belief that medical science should provide chemical comfort, is deeply embedded in our culture. Benzodiazepines were both a cause and a symptom of this shift. As we look to the future, the question is whether we can learn from this history. Can we develop a more nuanced understanding of when pharmaceutical intervention is appropriate and when other approaches might serve better? Can we build a medical system that respects both the value of effective medication and the risks of over-reliance on chemical solutions? Can we, as individuals and as a society, make peace with the reality that some degree of anxiety and discomfort is an unavoidable part of human existence? The benzodiazepines will not disappear. They remain useful drugs for specific applications: acute anxiety, seizure emergencies, alcohol withdrawal, pre-surgical sedation. Used carefully for short periods, they can provide genuine benefit. The challenge is to use them wisely, with full knowledge of their risks without repeating the mistakes of the past. The millions who became dependent on these drugs, who suffered through withdrawal, or who remained trapped in chronic use, deserve acknowledgement and support. Their experiences should inform medical practice and policy. The lessons of the benzodiazepine era should be taught to every medical student, every resident, every practicing physician. This is not a story with a tidy ending. The consequences of decades of overprescribing will reverberate for years to come. People will continue to struggle with dependence, to endure difficult withdrawals, to grapple with the long-term effects of these drugs on their brains and bodies. But perhaps there is wisdom to be found in this struggle. Perhaps the benzodiazepine story can teach us something about the limits of pharmaceutical solutions, about the complexity of mental health, about the need for humility in the face of powerful drugs that alter consciousness and brain chemistry. The little pills that promised to take away anxiety did exactly that for a while, but they could not deliver on the deeper promise, the one that was never explicitly made but was always implied, that chemical intervention could provide lasting peace, that you could medicate away the human condition, that there was an easy answer to the hard questions of how to live. That promise was always an illusion. The pills were real, the chemistry was real, the relief was real, but it came at a price that was higher than anyone understood at the time, and we are still, all of us, paying that price. The sunset comes slowly for a pharmaceutical empire. There are no dramatic collapses, no sudden revelations, no single moment when the world realizes its mistake. Instead, there is a gradual fading, a quiet acknowledgement that the miracle was not as miraculous as once believed. Benzodiazepines have not been banned. They have not been withdrawn from the market. They remain on pharmacy shelves, in medicine cabinets, in the pockets and purses of millions. But their reign has ended. The cultural moment when Valium was the most prescribed drug in the world, when benzodiazepines were seen as the solution to modern life's anxieties, is over. What remains is a more sober assessment. These are powerful drugs with legitimate uses and serious risks. They should be prescribed carefully, used sparingly, and discontinued when possible. The guidelines say this. The medical literature says this. Increasingly, doctors and patients both understand this. But understanding does not undo the past. The people who became dependent on these drugs during the era of casual prescribing still exist. Some have successfully withdrawn, enduring months or years of difficult symptoms to reclaim their lives. Others remain on their medications, making the calculated decision that the benefits still outweigh the risks, or simply unable to face the prospect of withdrawal. And there are the casualties, the ones who did not survive. The overdoses, almost always in combination with other drugs, the suicides that occurred during the dark depths of withdrawal, when the brain's chemistry was so disrupted that death seemed like the only escape. The lives lived in a fog of cognitive impairment, opportunities missed, relationships damaged, potential unrealized because of the cumulative effects of years on these medications. These casualties are harder to count than the deaths from opioids or the destruction wrought by methamphetamine. They are diffuse, spread across decades, often attributed to other causes. The cognitive decline blamed on aging that might have been medication-induced. The anxiety disorder that never truly resolved because the medication that was supposed to treat it had become part of the problem. The benzodiazepine story is a mirror held up to modern medicine and modern society. It reflects our faith in pharmaceutical solutions, our willingness to medicalize human experience, our desire for quick fixes to complex problems. It also reflects genuine suffering, the real need for effective treatments, the value of medications that can provide relief when nothing else can. The lesson, if there is one, is about balance and humility. Balance between the benefits and risks of powerful interventions. Humility about what medicine can and cannot do, about the limits of our understanding, about the unintended consequences of our actions. As the sun sets on the benzodiazepine era, we are left with questions more than answers. How do we treat anxiety and insomnia effectively without creating dependence? How do we support the millions who became dependent on medications prescribed by trusted doctors? How do we prevent the next pharmaceutical crisis, the next class of drugs that promises miracles but delivers tragedy? These questions have no easy answers, but they must be asked. The story of benzodiazepines, from the laboratory breakthroughs of the 1950s to the present-day reckoning, is not just history. It is a warning and a lesson for the future. The little yellow pills, the blue ones, the white ones, they sit in bottles on shelves, chemical compounds waiting to be consumed. They are neither good nor evil. They are tools, and like any tool they can help or harm depending on how they are used. The era when they were used carelessly, prescribed liberally, consumed without question, that era is ending. What comes next is uncertain, but it must be better. It must be wiser. We owe that much to those who suffered, who became dependent, who struggled to reclaim their lives from these deceptively simple molecules. The powder that promised calm, that ruled an era, that corrupted medical practice and damaged countless lives, is being put in its proper place. Not banned, not forgotten, but understood, finally, for what it truly is. A powerful drug that can provide relief but demands respect, that offers benefits but exacts a price, that should be used carefully and cautiously with full knowledge of its capacity for both healing and harm. This is the legacy of benzodiazepines. This is the story of when Valium ruled 1970s America and what happened after. This is the reckoning we are still living through. The story is not over. It will not be over for as long as these drugs exist, as long as people suffer from anxiety and insomnia, as long as medicine searches for chemical solutions to human problems. But perhaps we can learn from what has come before. Perhaps we can do better. Perhaps